All right, let's get this going. Thank you everybody for joining us. This is a 4Kitchens Presents webinar. The title of it is Component Driven Development with Emulsify. We'll be listening to Evan Wilhite, our Senior Front-End Engineer, and Brian Lewis, Front-End Engineer. They'll be talking to us about this fantastic tool that we've built here at 4K and all the possibilities, the ways that it can help you with your development. And if you have any questions or comments throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A feature that Zoom has, or you can also use Twitter. Our handle is @4Kitchens, and the hashtag is 4KEmulsify. All right, guys.
Hey everybody, I'll go ahead and start us off. My name is Brian Lewis, and as Lucy said, I am a front-end engineer at 4Kitchens. And I'll go ahead and let Evan introduce himself, and we'll keep going.
Hi, I'm Evan, Senior Front-End Engineer. Glad you guys are here today.
Awesome. So we'll start out this presentation by talking about a little bit about Emulsify, but we're mainly going to talk about component-driven design and development and how all that works, and then later talk about the tool that we built, Emulsify, that allows us to implement component-driven design in our Drupal 8 projects. So Emulsify, as you can see on the screen, is a design and prototyping tool that uses atomic design principles and modern front-end best practices to develop a living style guide that can be easily implemented into any CMS that can render twig files. So that includes things like Drupal 8, I believe WordPress that can do twig files, but we've also thrown in the essentials needed to build a Drupal 8 theme out of the box. So atomic design, if you're not familiar with that, is a component-driven design methodology for creating design systems. We'll talk about component-driven design in a second, but essentially components are isolated, reusable chunks of a website. So they can be small, like inputs, labels, and buttons. They can be medium-sized, like a header, footer, or a card, or they can be large, like a landing page template or a full photo gallery. And Emulsify adopts the metaphor of atomic design, where the smallest components are atoms, which are assembled into molecules, and then organisms, and then templates, and finally pages. That's a term that was coined by Brad Frost, and it's just one of the component-driven design methodologies, and it's the one that we chose to use for this project. And I'm going to pass over to Evan to talk about component-driven design.
All right, so yeah, as we kind of back out and get a high-level view, it's helpful to talk about just what component-driven design is in and of itself. It's kind of used as one of those terms that gets thrown around that can mean a few different things. So to explain what we mean by that, we simply mean the methodology of taking your components on your website, and for us, that actually includes pretty much everything that we build. So it means componentizing everything that you build. So your markup, your CSS, your JavaScript. It is a method that allows you to isolate those things, to have for each component to have your markup, your CSS, in our case we use Sass as well, and your JavaScript, isolated and in its own place. And the benefits of this are many. For one, it's easy to reuse these components later because it's very clearly separated out, and as we're going to show here in a minute, just from the class names that you use to how you write your markup, it's very simple. It's also really easy over the growth of the project to actually remove things. I'm sure many of you as front-end developers, especially if you've been in this field for a long time, remember these large-scale projects kind of scaling over time and not scaling well when it came to especially CSS, but really front-end in general. And so what you ended up doing was just tacking on extra code as the project grew, which is obviously something that we want to get away from. So this methodology allows us to build things that are isolated enough that they can be removed later without harming everything else. It also helps you to make sure that you're using one single source for your code. So when you build that component and you reuse it somewhere else, you're simply using, in our case, a twig function or a few functions to allow you to do that, to where you're not duplicating that code, and there's kind of a single source for any errors and all of that. In order for the CSS to be truly componentized, and I kind of referenced this a little bit, but you have to use a methodology that also supports that. There are a few of them out there. In Emulsify, we have adopted kind of a BIM methodology approach. In this presentation, we'll talk about what we call the pseudo BIM methodology, but we're actually refactoring right now to be pretty much more standard with how BIM wants to do, traditionally wants to have you use class names. So to go over BIM in and of itself real quickly, so BIM stands for block element modifier. So a block would be your element itself. So in this case, we're using the example of a contact form. So you can see that class is contact form. The element is going to be an element within that block, and you can see we're using the double underscore syntax for BIM. So contact form, double underscore submit. And then a modifier is just a way of applying a modified state or a modified class so that you can style it. So in this case, we have contact form, double underscore submit, double dash disabled. And that's just one example of a modifier. Obviously, you can use those to style however you want.
So I'll go ahead and jump in real quick. That's standard BIM, and it's kind of the way we're going, but if you were to download Emulsify at the moment, you're gonna get this kind of pseudo BIM methodology that we have in place, and that is very similar. So if you add, if you're using the contact form, you got the same block class, but the element on that is gonna have the submit class, which is kind of what we're calling our base class, and then also has the block element attached to it. So you're gonna have the submit and the contact form double underscore submit class. And then if you add a block name and a modifier in our into Emulsify, on that same element, if you're using like the disabled, you'll have the submit base class, the submit disabled modifier class, and then the contact form double underscore submit block class. And that's kind of the way it is right now. Evan alluded to the fact that we're kind of refactoring some things, so this might change over time, but this is what's been working for us when we've actually used this in practice. It's just helped us not have to write as much or duplicate as much CSS, but we're still, the tool is very much in progress, and so things are changing constantly. And if you go check out right now, there's a ton of PRs that are already there ready to change some big chunks. If you are unfamiliar with BIM or not sold on using BIM, the reason we do is for CSS specificity, and so that things can be isolated. Because we're isolating our components like the twig HTML, basically the twig files, the CSS also needs to be isolated if it's truly going to be an isolated component. So it shouldn't be inheriting styles from another component because then it's not isolated. You can't pull it out or drop it in for another project or reuse it somewhere else. You'll have to be doing a lot of overriding. And here's a link on specifics of CSS specificity. It's pretty complicated and not really the topic of this, but that's just a reason why we're using BIM. Evan, you want to talk about the style guide?
So yeah, style guides have been around for a long time, obviously, and for a long time on at least web projects, we would use those as kind of a static way to capture a design at a moment in time. And it had the intention of staying relevant to the project, but when it was done in that way and it wasn't connected with the pieces that were being built, what naturally happened, obviously, as the project grew and as people's time got short who were working on the project, is those two things got out of sync, and so the style guide just became sort of a relic of the original build. So it became very important very quickly as we started doing these style guides. We kept trying to find ways to make these living. And so what we mean by living style guide is many of these things are just things that define a style guide. So a place to document styles and patterns on the website. Really, this can include a huge number of things, from your animations to your layouts to all of the elements themselves. It's also a really nice way to keep designers and developers in sync, especially if this is a public, either as the developers clone this down locally and share it, or if it's a public URL that if you have a website for your application that lives on there, you can actually share this between designers, developers, and clients as a way to kind of keep in sync during a build process, and even after the build process as you're kind of going into different phases and adding things. It's also a really nice way, and this is especially true for atomic design, to organize and distill complex interfaces. So to break down all of these sort of components. So if you think about like a header or a footer, these can be fairly complex depending on the nature of the website. But if you break those down into some form, some methodology that takes, in our case, we use atomic design. So it breaks those down to its smallest parts first, and then you continue to build up. And so it kind of gives you a frame of reference, even from the outside of the project, to where you're seeing as a client or as a fellow designer developer, you're seeing these elements being built from smallest to largest. Also in our case, which we'll probably talk about here in a minute, in Pattern Lab, it also gives you a way to sort of share notation. So you're not just sharing the code itself, but you can actually give each component its own notes for future developers or for the designer. There are even sort of states that you can run of like, this has been accepted or it's in review. Those are kind of a couple of benefits with Pattern Lab itself. So a living style guide is one of the best ways to communicate design standards. It's also a great reference for the whole team to understand how the application will look and feel. And it's a great way to convey design language, design rationale, explain how to use the markup, which is kind of what I was referring to in the last part. Living style guides should change and adapt to new needs and challenges that arise during the project, be consistently refined and revised, and not be written in stone. Those things are all true, and it's really in the web world, using a style guide without it being a living style guide, without it changing and growing as the project changes and grows, at least in my experience, was kind of a fruitless effort. It was a lot of time spent for something that always got out of date. So it's very important for that to be able to handle those changes.
So in Emulsify, we're using Pattern Lab to create our living style guide. And this is because of the move to Twig and Drupal 8. So with that, a ton of tools open up to our disposal. And one of those is Pattern Lab, which is at its base a dynamic prototyping and organizational tool, popularized by Brad Frost, I mentioned earlier, also coined the term atomic design. But so what we've done is, by integrating Pattern Lab, our components can be built and managed in ways that make sense to your workflow. So instead of using Drupal's template names and structure, you can create templates that make sense for the project, the developers, and even the client. I think Brad spoke to us recently and told us that he didn't even, in one of the projects he didn't even use atomic design names because that client just couldn't wrap their head around atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages. And so even though he's the one that created all that stuff, in his project he renamed it because it made sense to the client. So you can do that with these tools. And then once the templates are ready for production, connecting to Drupal is as easy as using a Twig function, like an include and extends or embed from the Drupal template to the component files. So I don't want to gloss over that. All of the components in the living style guide are the actual templates in use on the live site. You don't copy from your style guide into the Drupal site. You literally use the components that you've created in your style guide on your live site. You'll kind of see how it works in a minute, but it's the exact same thing. Which means, like it says here at the bottom, you don't have to worry about components going out of date or looking different on the live site than in the style guide.
So yeah, that takes us into the specific goals of Emulsify. So at the outset, when we started discussing a tool to help us sort of define our front-end workflow, that was a huge, huge desire that we had, was not only to have this living style guide, but to have this single source for every piece of code on the project, a canonical source for every component, if you will. And so the goals of Emulsify are to have that single source, so there's no duplication of efforts. There's also, if there is an error, you're taking care of that error in one place. All the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are in the actual component library, meaning they are in the directory that contains all of your patterns that you're building for the project. And so they're not living, some of them in patterns and some of them maybe over in Drupal specific folders, and we'll show the difference between that here in a minute. And then another goal of ours, we at Four Kitchens, and I'm sure many of you guys do multiple kinds of projects. And so a lot of times we have, a JavaScript project going on in one place and Drupal project in another. And it's very important for us to support as best we could sort of platform agnostic development. And so the kind of furthest that we've gone with Emulsify in terms of heading towards a specific platform is choosing Twig as the templating language, just because it does tie in so easily with Drupal, but it's also a really low barrier of entry, similar to Mustache or templating languages like that. So it made sense on many levels to choose it. But yeah, you can, in theory, you can use Emulsify just as a prototyping tool, and you can also tie it in with any system. So yeah, this is what I was kind of referencing earlier. So this is, if you imagine how you used to work on a Drupal project, or how we all used to work on a Drupal project, there was a folder for all of your markup, all of the PHP files, or in Drupal 8, the Twig files. And that directory was usually a single directory. In Drupal 8's case, this templates folder. And you'll notice even here, I'm just referencing a small section, that things are organized based on items that are very much system specific. These don't have anything to do with what the project looks like to a designer, to a client. These have to do with things that make sense to a Drupal developer. So when you look at this, whether you're a developer, whether you're a front-end developer, it requires that you have system-specific knowledge. So there's already a barrier to entry. You look at this templates folder and you go in there and you say, okay, I know what a Drupal block is. This thing is a block, so I'm going to go into this blocks folder to look for that. Even though that could be any number of things. It could be a view returning dynamic data. It could be a little piece of content that's just in a custom block. And then in this content folder, which is even more vague, you have sort of all of the content Twig files, so the node Twig files and things like that. So the downsides of that, if you go back to the previous slide, it requires system-specific knowledge, and it's also organized by system-specific criteria, which these are two things that are not good for ramping up and for sharing with other developers, especially as you hire front-end developers who are maybe not familiar with Drupal, but are very good front-end developers. So yeah, this Emulsify and this component-driven development methodology helps us move into a design-based organization. So it helps us move into, in our case, using atomic design, this structure that makes sense, where you're not only organizing from smallest to largest in atomic design, so atoms and then molecules and then organisms, but your files become very readable because you get to choose the names of those files. So they actually don't have to have anything to do with the system that they're built on. You get away from the complexity that's required with that. Drupal tries its best to do that simply, but it naturally has to accommodate multiple scenarios. And so you'll notice here that files literally, have these very easily readable names, very findable if you're going to debug something. So under atoms here, we have the button and input, Twig files, molecules, we have a form, organisms, a contact form. So it's literally becomes as simple as that. So in component-driven design organization, we have these design-driven components, and just to reiterate something that we said earlier, the idea is to keep all of these files in one place. And I actually just noticed a typo here. What this is supposed to say is patterns, organisms, and then there's a directory for the contact form. And so you have your contact form organism, and in that contact form, which is the point of this slide, you have not only your markup and your Twig file, but you have all of your CSS, or in this case SAS, and also your JavaScript. So if there's JavaScript needed for that component, those are all there in one location. So all related files are in a single place. And you have, we're using BIM in our case for CSS isolation as well. So not only is your directory isolated in terms of the code that you're writing, but your CSS is isolated as well. And again, this allows for that not only findability and readability, but it allows you to easily remove pieces from your project later on and know that you're not affecting things. So with design-driven components, another benefit of this is that you get to decide the variable name. So if you're familiar with Drupal 8 templates, again, just like the naming conventions for the files themselves, the naming conventions for variables in Drupal have to be as complex as Drupal is. But if you're writing these twig files yourself, then in your contact form, when you need to write a variable for something in Twig, you get to name that variable whatever you want, and it can be as simple and logical as you need it to be for this specific component. So you can have those very simple, readable variable names, and then later when you pass that file in using an include, extend, or embed, which we'll show an example of that here in a minute, you can pass that variable to the actual Drupal variable, which is an expected usage of those Twig functions. Also, I wanted to show an example in here real quick of Pattern Lab itself coming into play. So again, for the metadata that you can actually show on the front end of Pattern Lab, so for designer notes and developer notes, it actually shows up in the Pattern Lab instance. That uses Markdown, which is a very easy notation tool for that sort of thing. And then for the data itself, it uses YAML, which again is a very nice and easy format for that data style. You can actually also use JSON in Pattern Lab, but as Drupal developers, which I expect many of you are, the YAML is very approachable.
So I'll jump back in real quick and talk about how we actually build our components. So we're going to kind of build this link component out to what you'll see in Emulsify when you download it. But I wanted to start with the smallest things so we can kind of explain things as we go. So in Emulsify, we have a link component. It's just an A tag. It has a class of link. Has an href of link URL, and then there's the link content. So typically you'd pass a URL into there and some text into the link content. Pretty straightforward. And like Evan was just saying, these variables make sense to the component because we're talking about a link component, so we want our variables to make sense. There I'm highlighting the two variables we've created. So because we're using BEM syntax or a pseudo BEM at this time, we need the block and the modifier classes. So in order for that, we're going to add this little for loop that says for a modifier in link modifiers, create a class that is link dash dash the modifier. And I can show you how we do that in just a minute when we actually see Emulsify in action. But basically, you can pass in like a disabled modifier, and then you get a link and link double dash disabled classes. And for the block name, we have the same thing in there. We say if we're passing in a link block name, then create a class of link block name double underscore link. So it's very manual, so that you can have just the markup that you want, as opposed to using like classy out of the box for Drupal 8. And then you can also do things like add data attributes. When I was presenting this a couple weeks ago, somebody asked, what if I want to do like a target equals underscore blank or something that's not a class? And so during that meetup, we came up with this, which is pretty much the same as your modifiers, but it says for attribute, comma value in link attributes, print out attribute equals quote value. So you can pass those in pretty easily. And sometimes you want to link something other than text, like an image, for example. We use this in our logo component. We're adding a twig block in this case called link content, that we can replace. If you've never used a twig block before, a block is essentially a chunk that gets completely rewritten or replaced. So instead of having that link content variable in there, we could replace it with something like the image component, which is exactly what we do for the logo component. And you'll actually see that in just a minute when we get to the demo.
All right, so now how do we use this component? So let's talk about these functions that we've referenced. So one analogy, and this is actually another thing that we've pulled from Atomic Design, but it helps in understanding this, is to sort of understand this concept of Russian nesting dolls. And we have this just amazing picture of Star Wars Russian nesting dolls, which is kind of weird, but But yeah, so Russian nesting dolls are these items that you can, I don't know if you can tell by the picture, but you can actually store these inside each other so that it becomes one thing. And so that's the idea with using these include, extends, and embed functions. So it allows you to build these tiny components and to include them in their larger components, to then include, you might be including a couple of atoms in a molecule component, and then including a few molecules in an organism component. And so I don't know if you remember earlier in the slides, but the Pattern Lab way of showing this is that animation of showing, a search form title and the input and the submit button. And then they come together in a molecule, which is the search form itself. And then the molecule of the search form goes into the header. And that's the way that they show that. And so that's what these functions allow us to do. So this is an example from our card twig component in Emulsify. So a card is typically a component on a web project that sometimes it has an image and then a title and text. I think that's probably the most common way that you see it, but it obviously covers many, many things on a project. And so we have a card component built into Emulsify. So here's an example of where we are using an include, which is a function that you can write to literally say, include this twig markup from somewhere else. So this, whenever this file is referenced, actually go to this linked twig file and include it. And you'll see here that we're starting to pass these variable names in. And so this is what I was referencing earlier with when you get into the Drupal side, you can pass your variables into what the file that you're referencing, what that file is going to expect. Well, we actually do that with every single file. And the reason is your linked file, as you maybe saw earlier, has these linked specific variables, things that make sense for the linked file. So link URL, link content. But when we are in this card file, we want to rename those variables. And the reason for that is whenever you're going to include this card file, let's say you're going to include it in a Drupal node teaser, that's going to be your card. You don't want to have to be digging for what these variables are. So you don't want to have to say, oh, I need to pass on a link URL here or this here. You only have one layer of the variables themselves that you need to be referencing and remembering.
So this is actually a good example of that too. When we're including our heading 2 for the title of the card, we don't want to have to, say my label variable from Drupal is passed to the heading 2 field, variable in the card. We want to be able to say my label is my card title. And so that's why we're renaming the variables as we go up so that things make sense as we use it. So here's another quick example of the image, and this is just going to build up so that we can create our logo component that kind of puts things together. This is just a real basic image component that we reuse all over. So it basically accepts an image source, an image alt, and then the modifiers and block names, just like before. Here's using the link component we've shown you, the image component we've shown you, and we're also going to show how to replace that block section in the link. So we're going to embed this time instead of include. Embed allows us to replace blocks. So we're embedding the link twig component, setting some variable names, and we're also passing some variables, like the default block name is going to be logo, so that we have logo _ link, and the default in this case makes sense to just go to the home page. And then below we've got the block link content. So this is that section that is replacing the entire block in our link component. In this case, we're replacing it by including the image component and then passing some information into that component. So basically, this is going to build out our logo, which is basically a linked image of our logo with some default things like going to the home page and alt text, etc. I think you're muted, Evan.
Yeah, sorry. What he was covering there, this is just to reiterate, and this is helpful as we were going through and trying to figure out what twig functions we should be using. I think we were asking the wrong question, because it really just is a design decision at the end of the day. Obviously, there are some limitations to some of them. So include is kind of the default go-to. You cannot pass in blocks of content to it, but it's a very simple, it's the simplest one to read, and it's the simplest one to use. So whenever we have a simple use case, we use an include. Extends allows you to pull in that file and replace the blocks. So it just allows you to replace the content in the block section. Embed actually allows you to pass in variables to the file that you're including. So it's the most robust one. And what we have found actually is that we have found that we're either using include or embed, which is what this slide is referencing. And this goes through kind of what I was just describing. But yeah, we found that in simple use cases, we will use an include. And then if you look at our files in Emulsify, you'll notice when we use embed, it's almost always because we are passing variables up the chain into the file at the outside of the block that we're expecting to pass in. So we found that we're mostly using include and embed. From the research that Brian has done, it doesn't sound like there's any performance issues with any of these. So again, it's just a design decision at the end of the day. What functionality do you need? What makes it the most easily readable? So something else to keep in mind, and this is something that we have added to the wiki for Emulsify. If you go to the Emulsify GitHub URL, you'll notice that we do have a wiki there that we are constantly adding to. But this is something to keep in mind. It's not a hard and fast rule, but as you're building Drupal sites, it's helpful to kind of remember things about. So atoms are basic components and where the base markup lives. And then molecules, organisms, and templates are then built with those smaller components. And so when we initially started to build in this, we realized that the more we were doing custom markup and recreating things at the molecule and organism level, the less true we were being to this system. Again, it goes back to the Russian nesting dolls analogy. So in molecules and organisms and templates, you'll notice in our files now that they're just referencing these other items, except for the very few sort of outer markup elements that we need to wrap those items in. So if you're making a card, for instance, you might have an outer section or div for the card itself, and then everything internally is just using an include or embed. All right, so let's talk about how we use these in Drupal. We just have a couple of simple examples here. And this one actually comes from the heading file in Emulsify, so you'll see this in there. And then you'll see in the very small at the top that it's actually where we're using this is the page title file in Drupal. So this is an expected twig file in Drupal, and the default content for this twig file is the markup itself and some other things. But in our case, in using this methodology, in your page title Drupal file, we literally just have this include. So there's no markup living over here on the Drupal side. We're including all of our markup from our component itself. And we're just referencing that. And then you'll see here, this is the same thing that we've been looking at. We're just passing variables in this case, Drupal has a very simple one for page title. So we're passing in title to the heading one, and then we're passing in that block name of page title, which is again, just a choice. A little bit more of a complex example. So let's look at this is from a homepage header, which was a custom thing, built for a project. But it's a good example of sort of getting into more of the guts of Drupal, and it also shows you what some of your syntax will probably look like in trying to figure out twig variables. But you'll see we have these really simple, simply named variables, sensible, logical, readable variables on the left-hand side that are a part of our component. And we're passing in these specific twig values that Drupal wants to give for these items. So in the image case, we actually have to use a function and to pass in the variable that Drupal is passing for that image, or the image URL specifically. And then these other ones you'll see, like for the text or for URL, where you have to do some some kinting to find these variables and then pass these. But again, you kind of get to see that side by side. So again, this goes back to a front-end developer can build components. Someone who's good at front-end development doesn't have to have that Drupal knowledge specifically. And then someone who is a Drupal developer can easily connect the pieces. Someone who's used to using the tools for Drupal can connect the things. All right, so we do have a couple of questions. Brian, do you want to tackle these now before we
Yeah, the first thing from Alex is just letting everybody know what we're referencing in that particular slide. So I'm gonna call that answered. Let's see. Let's say I have a Drupal module scroll to top, just for example, so it can, any other module that includes functionality, it's including CSS, JS, icons, etc. Any recommendations on how you move this functionality to Emulsify in a real project? Do you want to actually tackle that, Evan, or?
Yeah, I can, and then Brian, you can answer as well because we might both have good things to say. This is a great question. I tend to not use Drupal modules for functionality that is front-end functionality. Every once in a while that happens, and one example I can think of off the top of my head is Chosen. So the Chosen module, and because it gives you front-end functionality on your project, but also because it provides some nice sort of back-end niceties in the Drupal UI for the client. So that's one that we use, but most often if I'm just using a front-end technology, I actually won't use a Drupal module that provides this thing that kind of lives in a strange place. And this is where this question is coming from, is like, I have a module that's in the modules folder and it contains a library that's in the libraries folder. How do I pull this on? So the answer, if you have to do this, at least in my experience, is you need to know that Pattern Lab itself and Drupal itself are forming the HTML for what they show at the end of the day. They are forming it separately. And so Pattern Lab actually has a directory, I believe called Meta. Is that right, Brian? Off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Contains the header and the footer of Pattern Lab itself. It's very simple. You can add CSS references in there in the head. You can add JS references in the header, the footer. And so if there have been instances where I have functionality that has to live outside of that directory, just for Pattern Lab's sake to demo it, I will just include references manually to those files that I need. But I will write use the scroll top example. If I'm actually writing code that uses scroll top in a component, that obviously will live in the component. And that way you can still use that module. But yeah, you want to go in and add that manually into the head of Pattern Lab.
I think that's good. I don't have anything to add to that. Maria also asked, what have been the major challenges adapting workflow and people to work with components in mind? Less than you'd think, I think would be my answer. I haven't had any major challenges. The only challenge I've had working with it so far is the client wanted like the basic page structure, like all like kind of laid out before it was like a high fidelity design. And typically when we work with components, we're building the lowest fidelity or the highest fidelity, I guess, the smallest items first and then building out to make the page. And they wanted a page first and then like to develop things inside. And so that was a little iffy, but really all they wanted was like boxes and regions. And so that ended up not being a big deal. And we're going to it's an iterative design thing. They're actually working, it's actually a really fun project to work on because they want to be so iterative. So I haven't really had much issues. Evan, did you have anything?
The only thing that I would say, and this might be what Maria is referring to, is I've never had trouble selling Atomic Design or this approach to a client, because as soon as they see it, it's kind of one of those things that clicks and makes sense. Like, websites were always built this way. It's just we pretended they weren't and showed you entire high fidelity pages like Brian was just referencing. And if anyone has any experience in the web, like from a client perspective, they're usually like, yeah, that was terrible because we got this huge thing revealed to us and there are all these mistakes and we need to go back and change things. And so that side of it was actually much easier than I expected in terms of talking to clients about this approach, so far at least. But there have been some roadblocks with other developers, and they're mostly just to do with just small sorts of buy-in. And it's been, at least for myself and for the other developers that I've watched, as long as they try it, they kind of immediately buy in. They're like, yeah, this solves so many problems that I've had on past projects that I'm willing to push through the learning curve. And so one of the biggest learning curves of using Emulsify is actually a learning curve of using any kind of component-driven development in Drupal, which is connecting the pieces. So if you are a Drupal developer specifically, passing in your markup and kinting and finding the variables that you need. And these aren't impossible things by any means, but that's sort of the ramp up, is that sometimes you could imagine people might bail on that. But again, my experience has been when a developer starts building using a tool like Emulsify, they become so thankful for the benefits that they're getting that they're like, yeah, I will push through and figure this out so that all of this stuff is isolated and readable.
Cool. We've only got like 15 minutes left, I think, so I would love to actually show you guys what Emulsify looks like out of the box. Before I do that, real quick, there's one more question I want to answer that. Pierre asked, how about performance? Have you guys noticed any difference between running Pattern Lab Twig versus just in Drupal? Without having done any in-depth studies, I want to say the Pattern Lab Twig files are just Twig files in the theme. So it's not like you're running Pattern Lab necessarily on the live site. It's not like there's something running in the background to make those things accessible. They're just files in a different place. And so I don't expect that there's any performance implication at all. Evan, have you run into anything?
I haven't. Yeah, to add to what Brian's saying, Pattern Lab actually produces a static website at the end of the day, and that's actually what gets deployed. So it's literally static files at the end of the day. Locally, which might be what he's referring to, I have not noticed any performance issues with Pattern Lab whatsoever. I have noticed performance issues with Drupal, but they're completely unrelated to this. They're usually related to the build. Yeah, they don't have anything to do with Emulsify. It's like how the build, what needs to be fixed, completely outside of what we're talking about. That's the only things that I've noticed.
Cool. And last question, because it's short before we get in. Evan's accent is from Tennessee. That's where he's from. And yes, we all love Evan's accent.
Hey, y'all.
Cool. So I have Emulsify here on my screen. I hope you guys can all see this. Can you? Are you still watching my screen? I hope so. Anyway, so basically all I've done is cloned Emulsify, run yarn install to build out the dependencies. You could do that with npm install as well if you want. We support both. Yarn is just a lot faster. And then you run npm start, and this is what compiles everything, starts the browser sync and all that stuff, and creates the static files that will become your Pattern Lab instance. So that's building. Your type on your screen is small. Please zoom in. Okay, let's see what I can do about this. Make things a little larger. I hope that's better. I've never used my screen this large before. Is that better, anonymous viewer? Okay, thank you. Cool. So this is what you get with Pattern Lab out of the box. It's real basic stuff. There's nothing super fancy. Where you can see the colors used on this theme, which are just white to gray. You can demonstrate your animations. We do support Flexbox, and so to create grids. We also have Singularity built in right now. So if you're more familiar with that, you can actually use that at the same time or instead of. We just have some different examples of how things are used, basic text styles and how they look out of the box, paragraphs, block quotes, bunch of fun stuff. Lists have some real basic styles, unordered, ordered, and definition lists. We have an image component. It's just a basic image that is by default 100% width. A logo, which is just referencing a logo, but nothing fancy. Some icons. Oh, the icons are super cool. Evan can maybe help me walk through this, but in the images, images icon source, in this folder, you can drop as many SVGs in here as you want. And part of the build process is it actually creates an image sprite using those SVGs and gives you all the classes and mixins that you need to use those. So you literally just drop your SVGs in here, and then you can start using your SVGs anywhere. It's stupid awesome. And that was Evan. He brought that in from somewhere.
You actually have to run gulp icons, by the way. That task is not run during the build process.
Okay.
The build as fast as possible. So that's a separate task, but that's noted in the notes in there. If you want to maybe show them the Pattern Lab notation for one of those. Or you can show them in the browser is what I meant. Like click one of them down.
Right.
Yeah, so this is the notation that you can get for other developers. You can actually set Pattern Lab. Pattern Lab has a few things in a kind of a base YAML config file that you can set. So you can actually set all of these to be open. On load, we have ours set to be closed just because we tell clients and other developers that they're there. But yeah, those are the notes we were referring to.
And these notes come from the markdown files that we talked about earlier. So in this case, this pattern doesn't have a markdown file, so there's no notes. But for the icons, we wanted to let people know how to use it. So we just created a markdown file and wrote everything in there. Okay, so we got checkboxes, some radios, and all this stuff. We have a button, and we've got two variations that we've demonstrated. Tables are styled pretty nicely. We support videos, and we actually support 16:9 and 4:3. The only difference is you pass a modifier class if you want a 4:3 video, just full, and then it is like that. But they are responsive, just using CSS out of the box. So you choose which one you want. We've got tabs styled. We have this accordion thing, and the reason this is here is to show how JavaScript works out of the box, and I can show that in a minute. Here's an example of a card, so an image, title, subtitle, text, and a read more link, and then a variation of the card. Info box is something we used on a project, so we went ahead and threw it in. Breadcrumbs, tabs again are here. Pagers, statuses, and here's an accordion, which is a bunch of the items that I just showed you, but basically put it together into a larger organism probably, and uses those. Here's an example of a card grid. So this is a grid component that includes the card item. And so we've got it a few times in here, and then just a variation of maybe you just wanted the image, title, and subtitle. Again, more grid stuff. And then the site footer and header aren't in there because those are kind of specific things to a project. But in the next just few minutes, I want to show you how these are kind of built. So at our atoms level, here's the link twig file that I showed you before. We're working on getting all of these documented because we started out just using it and then figured if we're going to share it with people, we should have some documentation so people know how to do it. So that's in progress. Here's the link. Let me show you the image real quick. Here's the image twig file. And then here's the logo, which again is embedding the link with the image itself. And that's how the logo was created over here. Let's go to something a little bigger, like a card maybe. So here's the card, and this actually is a PR up there already to make this refactor a little bit. So like, for example, we need to replace this image with the actual image component. And actually, well, I could show you what we're working on, but go to the GitHub and you can check out the PRs. There's some cool stuff that we have in the works. But this is just an example of how we have our heading 2, and we renamed it to card title. So in Drupal, when we want to pass the label in, we just pass it to the variable card title, card sub for subtitle, card body, and then the card link text and URL are the things that get passed in from Drupal. Are there any, let's see, there are a couple questions. Thomas wants to know if the webinar is going to be available to watch later. Lucy, I think you'd be the best to answer that.
Yeah, we're going to provide a recording of this webinar later on. If you signed up through Zoom, you'll have a link to the recording, and we'll also provide the slides through SlideShare.
Cool. And if you guys are in the Drupal Twig Slack channel, you can go to this URL if you're not in it and get invited automatically. Evan and I are both in there, as well as a bunch of other front-end people from 4Kitchens. So you can just go in there and ping us directly in there to ask questions about Emulsify. We are more than happy to answer all your questions. Anything else? Let's see. Maria did ask earlier, how do we integrate testing and approval, both internal and external? Evan, I think you'd be better to answer that than me.
How do you integrate testing and approval, both internal and external? So, well, number one, this creates a pattern lab static site for your repo. So even if you're just using it as a prototyping tool, we would push up that repo. I also just answered a question for somebody, letting them know about a feature that we just added, which is that you can, if you're storing your code on GitHub, you probably are familiar with GitHub pages, so you can actually serve a web page for one of your GitHub repos. And we just added a feature which basically you just say gulp deploy, you run the task gulp deploy, and it will actually deploy from your Emulsify root. It will deploy your pattern lab instance as your GitHub page for that repo. And so Brian, if you'll go to the wiki and go to the gulp tasks section, that's actually referenced in there. The wiki at
Where
the
is
top.
that?
The wiki at the very top.
Oh, in the wiki.
Yeah. And then the gulp config. So we have, number one, we have all the commands in here referenced that we're using. So it's a good place to reference. We actually have some performance testing tools that we use internally at 4K that you can leverage as well. Down there at the bottom, you'll see that it runs gulp deploy. So Brian, you can actually copy that Emulsify pattern lab public URL for that repo, for the Emulsify repo, and you'll see we're actually using that for even Emulsify's.
It's not there.
Oh, sorry. It's the GitHub page URL, which is different than github.com.
Oh.
Anyways, if you run gulp deploy, it'll actually deploy it to live. So you can have a pattern lab instance that way. We also, on our Drupal sites, obviously we have staging environments, and your pattern lab site is in your staging environment. You just have to find the URL. It's in your environment, and so we will send clients URL to the pattern lab instance. We've been sticking just a reference in HT access to actually just send them to /pattern lab, and it will resolve to the pattern lab index file.
Yeah, I was going to show that too real quick. In pattern lab and then public index.html, this file, if it's in your repo, it's up on live. So on any instance, like we have this going on some Pantheon projects, and so every multi-dev has this file specific to that multi-dev. So we can have different versions showing here's what's going to be new, and show them that pattern lab instance and on that multi-dev, and they see what's going to be actually changed before we actually merge it in to show them live.
I think we actually answered the next one. If you want to have the stock out displayed somewhere for the client or other team members, you do not have to have the pattern lab code located somewhere else. It can be inside of your repo, like we were just talking about, and it already is there. And again, if you're using GitHub, you can just say gulp deploy, and it'll deploy that as a GitHub page.
Thomas, looking forward to seeing you in Baltimore too. And Jim, oh, he used it when it was called 4K or Fork. We never actually, that was before we renamed it to Emulsify. He said it was easy to use, but we cleaned it up. Yeah, we definitely cleaned it up, and we're constantly cleaning it up. So a lot of the things that you've even seen today have PRs to update them to be a little bit easier to use and more flexible.
Yeah,
a lot of work's going into it constantly.
Yeah, I was going to say we should mention that this tool is, not only are we using this tool as our front-end tool at 4Kitchens, so this, it is constantly being updated because we are using it actively on projects, but it's also open source, so you can go and open PRs if you find yourself using different pieces of it and you find that you're working against it, please do let us know in the issue queue, and we can change it based on those use cases.
All right, looks like we don't have any more questions. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. We really enjoyed having you here. Like I said, we're going to have a recording of this webinar later on and the slides for you to download as well. A little bit of housekeeping. Please remember to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We actually broadcast this webinar live on Facebook. Today was our first live broadcast. Also, once you're on Facebook, you can sign up for our newsletter and stay up to date on anything that's happening at 4Kitchens, other webinars and events we'll be at. And speaking of events, we will see you in Baltimore. We're the game sponsor, and we have a bunch of fun things planned for you guys, including the showdown for free throw, where Brian will be probably showing down with that one guy from that one company. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.